The Class Struggle, adapted for the New York People from Karl Kautsky by Daniel DeLeon. 1. Socialism and the property-holding classes. Modern society cannot escape shipwreck unless it reorganize itself into a cooperative commonwealth. The establishment of the cooperative commonwealth implies a social revolution. It implies the overthrow of the capitalist system of production that has become a drag to all future development and an incubus upon the common weal. It means the placing of the machinery of production, now held and owned by landlords and capitalists, into the hands of the people. In other words, it implies the downfall of the system of private ownership in the implements of labor, land and capital, i.e., machines, tools, etc., and its substitution with public, common, collective ownership, to be operated for use and not for private profit. The substitution of the capitalist with the cooperative or socialist system of production is in the interest not of the propertyless classes alone, but of all classes. The same as slavery was an injury to the slaveholders, and its abolition tended to promote their highest interests, so is the present system of private ownership in the implements of labor injurious in the highest sense, even to the landlords and capitalists themselves, and its abolition would redound to the benefit of these as well. They also suffer severely under the contradictions that typify the modern system of production. One set of them rots in idleness, another wears itself out in a neck-breaking hunt after profits, and over the heads of all hangs the Damocles sword of bankruptcy, of shipwreck, and of final downfall into the class of the proletariat, i.e., the class that has been stripped of all the things necessary for production except its labor power, which, lest it perish outright, it is compelled to sell for starvation wages, happy if it succeed in doing that. It would be thought from these premises that all classes of society, capitalists and landlords no less than proletarians, would join in the establishment of the cooperative commonwealth. Yet the reverse is the case. Experience teaches, the fact glares us in the face, that the same as the slaveholders of old, the property holders of today, landlords and capitalists, cannot see their higher interests. The bulk of the property-holding and exploiting classes not only looks upon socialism with suspicion, but stands up against it in an attitude of the most bitter antagonism. Can this be due to ignorance, simply? The spokesmen among the adversaries of socialism are, however, the very people whose position in the government, in society, and not infrequently in science itself, should, presumably, fit them out best of all to understand the social mechanism and to perceive the law of social evolution. Indeed, so shocking are the conditions in modern society that no one who wishes to be taken seriously in politics or in science dares any longer to deny the justice of the charges preferred by socialism against the present social order. On the contrary, the clearest heads in all the various political parties of capital admit that there is some truth in those charges. Some even declare that the final triumph of socialism is inevitable, unless, however, society suddenly turn about and improve matters, a thing that these gentlemen imagine can be done offhand, provided this or that demand of this or that party be promptly granted and enforced. Others, again, admit unconditionally the ultimate triumph of socialism, but having the one thing at a time notion in their heads, and that thing always the wrong one, they ride their hobby horses and fly off at a tangent. In this way, even those members of the non-socialist political parties who have obtained the clearest insight into the teachings of socialism elude, by a somersault back or sideways, the most important consequences and conclusions of their own admissions. Nor is the reason for this odd phenomenon hard to discover, although certain important and not to be underrated interests of the property-holding classes plead against the system of private ownership in the means of production. Other interests, that lie nearer to the surface, and are more quickly felt by property holders, pull in an opposite direction. This is especially true with the rich. They have nothing to gain forthwith by the abolition of private property and the means of production. The beneficent results that would flow therefrom would be ultimately felt by them as well, but such results are comparatively too far off to carry much immediate weight. On the other hand, however, the disadvantages that they would suffer are self-evident and would be felt on the spot. The power and distinction they enjoy today would be gone at once, and not a few might be deprived also of their present ease and comfort in idleness. Matters stand otherwise with the lower ranks of the property-holding and yet exploited classes, the small producers, traders, and farmers. These have nothing whatever to lose in point of power and distinction, and they can only gain in point of ease and comfort by the introduction and development of the socialist system of production. But in order to be able to realize this fact, they must first rise above and look beyond the horizon of their own class. From the narrow field of observation occupied by the small producers, traders, and farmers, the capitalist system of production cannot be understood, however much they may and do feel its harrowing effects, and consequently, modern socialism can be understood by them still less. The one thing of which they have a clear understanding is the absolute necessity of private ownership in their own implements of labor in order to preserve their system of production. It is a forced conclusion that so long as the small industrialist stands up as small industrialist, the small farmer as small farmer, the small trader as small trader, so long as they are still possessed of a strong sense of their own class, so long will they be bound to hold fast to the idea of private ownership in the means of production, and to resist socialism, however ill they may fare under the existing order. Private ownership in the implements of labor fetters the small producers, farmers, and traders to the sinking ship of their respective pursuits, long after these have ceased to afford them a competence, and even when they might improve their condition by becoming wage workers outright. Thus it happens that private ownership in the instruments of production is the secret force that binds all the property-holding classes to the present system of production, notwithstanding the ill effects of the system upon the large capitalists, and notwithstanding the subjection of the small holders themselves to exploitation, and the caricature into which it has turned property in the hands of the latter. Only those individuals among the small producing classes who have despaired of the preservation of their class, who are no longer unable to see the fact that the industrial or agricultural form of production upon which they depend for a living is doomed, only they are in a condition to understand the teachings of socialism. But lack of information and a narrow horizon, both of which are the natural results of their condition, make it difficult for them to realize the utter hopelessness of their class. Their misery and their hysterical search for a means of salvation have hitherto only had the effect of making them the easy prey of any demagogue who was sufficiently self-asserting and who did not stick at making promises. Among the upper ranks of the property-holding class, a higher degree of culture is found, commanding a broader horizon, and among them not a few are still affected by ideological reminiscences from the days of the revolutionary struggles carried on by the then oncoming capitalist class against the feudal regime. But woe to that member of those upper ranks of the property-holding class who should be foolhardy enough to show an interest in socialism or to engage in its propaganda. The alternative promptly confronts him either to give up his ideas or to snap all social bonds that thitherto held and supported him. Few of these are equipped with the requisite vigor and independence of character to approach the spot where the roads fork. Very few among these few are brave enough to break with their own class when they have reached that spot. And finally, of these few among the few, the larger portion have hitherto soon grown tired, recognized the indiscretions of their youth and became sensible. The ideologists are the only ones among the upper ranks of the property-holding classes who support it is at all possible to enlist in favor of socialism. But even with these, the large majority of those among them who have gained a deeper insight into social conditions and into the problems that spring therefrom, the information they have acquired moves them mainly to wear themselves out in fruitless searching after what they style a peaceful solution of the social question, i.e., in searching after a solution that should reconcile their more or less developed knowledge of socialism and their conscience with the class interests of the capitalist class. But this task is as impossible as to produce a wet fire or burning water. Only those ideologists who have not only gained the requisite theoretical knowledge, but who are brave and strong enough to break with their class, are able to develop into genuine socialists. Accordingly, the cause of socialism has little to hope for from the property-holding classes. A few of its members may be won over to socialism, but these will be only such as no longer belong by their convictions and conduct to the class to which their economic position assigns them. These will ever be a very small minority, except during revolutionary periods, when the scales will seem to be inclining to the side of socialism. Only at such times may socialists look forward to a stampede from the ranks of the property-holding classes. So far, the only favorable recruiting ground for the socialist army has been not the classes of those who still have something to lose, however little that may be, but the classes of those who have nothing to lose but their chains, and a whole world to gain, the proletariat, the working class. 7. Philanthropy and labor legislation. If every separate layer of the proletariat had been left to its own efforts, the uplifting process among them would have begun much later and been much slower and painful than it was in fact. Without outside aid, many a layer of the proletariat that now occupies an honorable position may not have been at all able to overcome the difficulties which are inherent in all beginnings, and accordingly also to the beginning of that process of uplifting the proletariat from the swamp into which it was cast by the development of capitalism. That aid came from many an upper social rank, from the upper ranks of the working proletariat as well as from the property-holding classes. The latter of these was of no slight value in the early days of capitalist large production. During the Middle Ages, and during the early days of our own history, poverty was so slight that public, mainly religious, and private benevolence sufficed to deal with it. It presented no problem for the solution of society. Insofar as it gave occasion for reflection, it was only the subject of pious contemplation. It was looked upon as a visitation from heaven, intended either to punish the wicked or to try the godly. To the rich, it was an opportunity to exercise their virtue. As, however, with the increment of the capitalist system among us, the unemployed increased, and poverty assumed stupendous proportions, the phenomenon of a large pauper class, that was as novel as it was dangerous, drew upon it the attention of all thoughtful and kindly disposed people. Our primitive means for the distribution of charity proved inadequate. To care for all the poor was soon felt to be a work that exceeded greatly the powers of the community. Then there arose in our midst a new problem: how to abolish poverty. A great variety of solutions were offered, according to the enlightenment and the humanity or inhumanity of the sources from which they proceeded. These proposals ran all the way from the Westchester, New York plan of drowning the poor up to the elaborate plans of our communistic colonies. The latter found great applause among people of elegant leisure, but their inadequacy revealed itself promptly. Poverty spread apace. The capitalist system ground the people down to proletarians by the thousands, and every proletarian swelled the volume of poverty. By degrees, however, the question of poverty put on a new aspect. The capitalist system of production took rapid strides until it became the ruling one in the country. In proportion as this evolution proceeded, the problem of poverty ceased to exist for the thinkers in the ranks of the capitalist class. Capitalist production rests upon the proletariat. To put an end to the latter were to render the former impossible. Colossal poverty is the foundation of colossal wealth. He who would eliminate the poverty of the masses assails the wealth of the few. Whosoever attempts to remedy the poverty of the workers, the existing rights of property, is pronounced a destructionist and is howled down as an enemy of law and order. True enough, neither fear nor compassion has ceased under this changed aspect of things to be felt among capitalist circles, and to tell in favor of the proletariat. Poverty is by them felt to be a source of danger for the whole social fabric. It breeds famine, pestilence, and crime. Accordingly, a few of the more clear-headed and more humane among the ruling classes are willing to do something for the proletariat, but to the bulk of these, who neither dare nor can afford to break with their class, the problem can no longer be the abolition, but only the alleviation of poverty. To abolish poverty were to abolish the proletariat, and that is not their purpose. The proletariat is to continue, able to work and satisfied with its condition. This is the extent to which capitalist philanthropy goes. Of course, within these bounds, philanthropy can manifest itself in manifold ways. Most of its methods are either wholly useless or, at best, able only to afford passing aid to isolated cases. As, however, during the first decades of our century, capitalist large production made its entry in England, at first in the textile industries, and was there accompanied with all the horrors which it alone is able to bring on, the clearest heads among the philanthropists arrived at the conviction that there was but one thing able to check the complete destruction of the workers in these industries, to wit, state laws for the protection of the workers, at least for the protection of the most defenseless among them, children and women. The capitalists engaged in large production did not yet, at that time, constitute the ruling portion of the capitalist class as they do today and as they do here. Many economic as well as political interests among the non-capitalist classes, especially the landlord class, took side in favor of limiting the powers of the large capitalists over their workmen. The movement in this direction was successful. It was supported by the consideration that, unless this power of the large capitalists was checked, the foundation of English industry, i.e., the working class, would perish. A consideration that could not fail to influence every member of the ruling class intelligent enough to see further than his own immediate interests. And furthermore, it was also supported by a few large capitalists who possessed sufficient means to adapt themselves to the proposed laws, and who realized that their less wealthy competition would thereby be ruined. All this notwithstanding, and notwithstanding the working class itself set in motion a powerful movement in favor of factory laws, it took a hard fight to obtain the first timid factory laws, and subsequently to extend them. Nevertheless, slight though those first conquests were, they were enough to awaken out of their lethargy those ranks of the proletariat in whose behalf they were passed, and to set in motion the tendencies that were to improve their social standing. Indeed, even before the movement could yet reward any victory whatever, the struggle to gain it was enough to reveal to the proletarians how important, how necessary they were, and that they wielded a great power. Already, these early struggles shook them up, imparted to them a sense of self-consciousness and self-respect, put an end to their despair, and set up before them a goal beyond the immediate future. Another and highly important means to improve the condition of the working class are the public schools. Their importance cannot be overestimated. Nevertheless, their effect in the direction of abolishing the proletariat as a class is inferior to that of thoroughgoing factory laws. The more fully the capitalist system develops, the more large production crowds out inferior forms of production or causes them to change their character, all the more important becomes the strengthening of factory and kindred laws, and their extension not only to all the branches of large industries, but also to those of small production and even of agriculture. But in the same measure as the importance of these laws grows also the influence of the large capitalists in modern society. The non-capitalist but property-holding classes, landlords, small producers, etc., become infected with capitalist modes of thought, and the thinkers and statesmen of capitalist rule, who formerly were its luminaries, soon sink to the level of gougers and bruisers of their class, ready to do its dirty work and to oppose tooth and nail everything that threatens its immediate interests. The devastation of its own working people by capitalist production is so shocking that only the most shameless and greedy capitalists dare to refuse a certain degree of statutory protection to labor. But for some important labor law, the 8-hour day, for instance, which is today equivalent to the 10-hour day of 40 years ago in England, and which would do something more than afford some slight relief, there will be found but very few supporters among the class of the property holders. Capitalist philanthropy becomes ever more bashful. It leaves more and more to the workers themselves the conduct of the struggle for their protection. The modern universal struggle for the 8-hour day bears a very different aspect from the struggle that was carried on in England 50 years ago for the 10-hour day. The property-holding politicians who advocate it are not moved by philanthropy, but because they are pushed to it by their constituents, the workingmen. The struggle for labor legislation is becoming more and more a class struggle between proletarians and capitalists. On the continent of Europe and here in the United States, where the struggle for labor laws commenced much later than in England, it bore this character from the start. The proletariat has nothing more to hope from the property-holding classes in its endeavors to uplift itself. It now depends wholly upon its own efforts. 8. The political struggle. The proletariat modeled its original organizations for defense upon the pattern of those of the guild journeymen, the Union. So, likewise, did it fashion its original offensive weapons whenever it faced capital in organized bodies, after those of the journeymen, the boycott, and the strike. For reasons peculiar to the historic days when the guild journeymen waged their battles against their masters, their weapons remained the same until their class became extinct. The modern proletariat, however, cannot abide by those original and primitive weapons. The more completely the several portions of which it is composed merge into a single working class, the more must its battles assume a political character. All class struggle is a political struggle. Even the bare requirements of the economic or industrial struggle compel the working men to set up political demands. Experience shows daily, in multiplying instances, that the capitalist state, or modern government, considers it one of its principal duties either to render impossible the organizations of working men, or, in countries where, like in the United States, the spirit of the age is felt too strongly to bluntly deny the working class such civic rights as those of voluntary organization, to render the organizations of labor ineffective by falling upon them with the combined forces of police, militia, and judiciary whenever the working men take the field against their employers in the economic struggles between the two. The theoretical freedom of combination is, accordingly, insufficient if the proletariat is to build up its organizations with such fullness and completeness as to render them adequate for their purposes. Hence, whenever in the United States the working class has stirred itself to improve its economic conditions, it has placed side by side with purely economic a series of political demands calculated to free it from the class outrages perpetrated against it by government and to prevent the effectiveness of its economic organization from being thwarted. These political demands are, to the American working men, of the biggest importance. They belong under the category of essential prerequisites, without which their further development becomes impossible. They are, to the labor movement, what light and air are to the human body. There are those who endeavor to contrast the political with the economic movement, and to draw hard and fast lines between them, and who declare that the working men should not mix the two. The fact is that the two, the political and the economic struggle, cannot be separated from each other. The economic struggle needs political rights and powers to be carried on successfully. And these political rights and powers will not drop into the lap of the proletariat from the moon. They will not be graciously conceded by the capitalist politicians in office. They have to be wrung from their hands. They have to be conquered. And their conquest requires the most energetic political activity possible. The independent political action of the working class, as independent from the favors, the aids, the promises of the bosses and capitalist class generally, as the economic action is and necessarily must be of the favors, aids, and promises of that class. On the other hand, in the last analysis, the political struggle is also an economic one. If there is any difference between the two, it is that the political struggle is a more far-reaching and deeper-cutting manifestation of the economic struggle. Not those laws only that concern the working class directly, also the great majority of all the others affect it more or less. It is an inevitable conclusion that, just the same as all others, the working class must strive for political influence and political power, must endeavor to make the government subservient to its own interests. The means to this end are universal, at least manhood, suffrage. In many a country, the working class is deprived of this powerful means, and there strives with might and main to acquire it. Here in the United States, the ballot is in the hands of the citizen working man. The attempts to strike it out of his hands, the direct and indirect schemes under all specious pretexts to disfranchise the American proletariat are numerous, but hitherto have not only been unsuccessful, but have had a contrary effect to the desired one. The American proletariat starts equipped with the most powerful political weapon, with the aid of which it can conquer all others. The task of the proletariat when it first starts its political struggles is generally made easy through the political conflicts that rage among the property-holding classes themselves. The industrial capitalists, the merchants, the landlords are generally at war with one another, and special interests always divide each of these classes into hostile political camps. During these political struggles, each side looks for allies and seeks to gain them through slight concessions. Sometimes, after a victory, the capitalist would break faith with his ally, but generally, during the first beginnings of the labor movement, the victorious capitalist fulfilled his promises. It thus happened that the capitalists often appealed through their political parties to the proletariat for aid, and thus themselves drew the working men into political action. So long as the capitalist uses the proletariat in this way, so long as the working class does not conceive the idea of standing out independently in the political field, the capitalists look upon it as their voting cattle, intended to strengthen the hand of its own exploiters. In this way, matters continue for a considerable time. But the interests of the proletariat and those of the capitalist class are so hostile to each other that the political alliance between the two cannot be lasting. The capitalist system of production is bound, sooner or later, to cause the participation of the working class in politics to take such shape that it splits off from the capitalist parties, and that the working man sets up his own, the Labor Party. This process lies in the very nature of things. There is no class interest but expresses itself in a political party. Just as soon as the working class realizes its class interests, it is bound to do what the other classes do, i.e., express itself politically. At what time the proletariat of a country will be so far matured as to take this decisive step, to out, so to speak, the navel string that binds it politically to the capitalist system out of whose lap it has sprung, depends, above all, upon the economic stage of development that such a country has reached. In other words, upon the degree of exploitation to which the proletariat is subjected, and upon the compactness of its ranks. There are a number of other circumstances that affect considerably the time when the working class assumes political independence. Of these, two are the most important. First, the degree of enlightenment that the respective working class enjoys upon its political and economic situation. Second, the attitude that the capitalist parties assume towards it. Both these circumstances have greatly promoted the movement of the working class in Germany, and hence it comes that the labor movement in Germany is further advanced than in any other country. And it is for just the reverse of these reasons, especially because of the hypocritical attitude of the political parties here, that with us the labor movement lags behind. But however the time may differ when, obedient to these different influences, the labor movement in a capitalist country takes the shape of a labor party, that time is sure to arrive as an inevitable result of the economic development. At the same time, every political party must strive to obtain the political upper hand. It is bound to endeavor to turn the power of the state to its own advantage, i.e., to use it in the interests of its class. In other words, it is bound to endeavor to become the ruling party in the state. By the very fact of its organizing itself into an independent political party, the working class turns its face towards this ultimate goal, the conquest of the political powers of the state, a goal which the economic development itself aids the working class to reach. In this respect also, the same as in respect to the time when the working men separate themselves from the capitalist parties, the time of their ultimate victory does not depend simply upon the degree of industrial development which the respective country may have reached, but upon a number of other circumstances, both of national and of international character. Furthermore, the manner in which this triumph may be achieved may vary greatly in different countries. That, however, upon which there can be no doubt in the mind of anyone who has followed the economic and political development of modern society, especially in the course of the last 100 years, is the certainty and inevitableness of the final triumph of the proletariat. While the proletariat is steadily extending itself, while it is growing ever stronger in moral and political power, while it is becoming ever more an economic necessity, while the class struggle is training it more and more into habits of solidarity and discipline, while its horizon is ever broadening, while its organizations become ever larger and more compact, while it becomes from day to day the most important and finally the only working class upon whose industry the whole social body depends, while it undergoes all these important changes and thus progresses steadily, the classes that are hostile to it melt away with equal steadiness and rapidity. They steadily lose in moral and political strength, and they become not only superfluous, but a block to the progress of production, which, under their superintendence, falls into greater and greater confusion, conjuring up more and more unbearable conditions. In view of this, it cannot be doubtful to which side victory will finally lean. The property-holding classes have already been seized with fear at their approaching end. They hate to admit to themselves the precariousness of their situation. They try to deceive themselves with false pretenses, and to drown their apprehensions in hilarity and trivial jokes. They close their eyes to the abyss towards which they are rushing, and they do not seem to realize that by such a conduct they not only hasten their own downfall, but render it all the more disastrous to themselves. As the last of the exploited classes, the working proletariat cannot put the power which it will conquer to the uses to which it was put by the previous classes, i.e., to roll the burden of exploitation from its own upon the shoulders of some other exploited class. It is bound to use its power to put an end to its own, and along with that, to all forms of exploitation. The source of the exploitation to which it is now subject is the private ownership of the machinery of production. The proletariat can abolish its own exploitation only by abolishing private ownership in the machinery of production. The circumstance of the proletariat being stripped of all property in the means of production renders it disposed to abolish private property in that. The exploitation to which the private ownership of the means of production subjects the proletariat compels it to abolish the capitalist system of production and to substitute it with the cooperative commonwealth, in which the instruments of production cease to be private and become social property. Under the rule of the capitalist system, i.e., of production for sale, cooperative production for use cannot become general. It is impossible to introduce the cooperative for the purpose of supplanting the capitalist system of production, while at the same time keeping the latter in force. This self-evident proposition establishes the fact that the socialist system of production must be the inevitable result of the triumph of the proletariat. Even if it were not consciously to use its supremacy in the state to recover possession of the machinery of production and to replace the capitalist with the socialist system, it would be compelled to do so by the logic of events, although, in that case, not without committing many mistakes, incurring much sacrifice, and squandering much time and energy. The end of it all will, under all circumstances, be the socialist system of production. Its triumph is unavoidable just so soon as that of the proletariat itself has become unavoidable. The proletariat is bound to use its triumph for the abolition of its own exploitation, and that it can never accomplish without establishing the socialist order. The economic and political development itself, noticeable today in the large capitalist undertakings, the combinations, syndicates, and trusts, point the proletariat the path to socialism and push it in that direction. The state of economic development which we have reached is certain to render abortive all attempts to move in a different direction which the proletariat of any country may make in case it should be disinclined to adopt the socialist system. It is, however, by no means to be expected that the proletariat of any country, once it has come to power, will reveal any disinclination to adopt the socialist system. To imagine that would be to imagine that the proletariat would be in its infancy at the same time that it had ripened politically, economically, and morally into manhood, equipped with the power and ability to overcome its enemies and impose its will upon them. Such a disparity of growth is least imaginable with the proletariat. Thanks to machinery, so soon as the proletariat had risen above its original degraded condition, it revealed a thirst for the acquisition of knowledge and a taste for grappling with problems of social import. Side by side with this intellectual development on the part of some, the economic development of modern society moves on with such rapid strides that even those ranks of the proletariat that are least favored cannot fail to learn the lesson so strikingly taught by the large combinations of capital. Everything combines to render the militant proletariat most accessible to the teachings of socialism. To the proletariat, socialism is no tidings of bad news. It is a veritable evangel. The ruling classes cannot accept socialism without committing suicide. The proletariat, on the contrary, derives new life from socialism, new vigor, new inspiration, and renewed hope. As time passes, socialism can only become more and more acceptable to the proletariat. In whatever country the proletariat reaches the point of establishing an independent labor party, such a party is bound, sooner or later, to take on socialist tendencies, even if it were not animated from the start by the socialist spirit. In the end, such a party cannot choose but become a socialist labor party.